Hey there, it's good to have you. Welcome back to No One Is Competent, the premier show about people getting their ass kicked by Napoleon, which is apparently what this show is all about. Now, even though that was a thing that I technically signed up for, even though I didn't realize how much ass kicking there would be, this is a show in general dedicated to the foibles and follies of the most powerful men, women, and non-binary pals to ever sling in history. My name is Azalea, and I am joined, of course, by Jay. Jay, give us a holler real quick.
Hello.
Isn't he great, folks? Anyway, if you want to contact the podcast, you can do that at nooneiscompetent@gmail.com. I check that once a day. You can reach us on Twitter at Azalea Wyatt and at Jaharis48. Our music is done by the legendary Sam Bryce, and we are here for the War of the Fourth Coalition! Air horn, air horn, air horn. Whoo, Jay, I don't know about you, but I've had 2 Adderall wash out of my system. I got 3 hours of sleep last night, up at 6:45.
Yeah.
I just did a full body workout. So, there is a good chance I am just going to pass out halfway through this recording.
Sounds good. Sounds appropriate.
You're going to be talking about some Russians getting dysentery or some shit. You're just going to hear a big crack of my skull thudding against my desk.
No, there's no dysentery talk today, I don't think. Not that it didn't happen, but that's just the background noise of warfare.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. I got a few more than 3 hours of sleep, probably 5. And yeah, I'm doing well enough.
That's a lot for you.
Yeah, maybe about average.
This is a great way to end a otherwise mostly utterly miserable fucking week. The mental has been bad, so I'm glad it's recovering. Listeners at home, you can just cross out your bingo sheets right now, where you have Azalea is eating during the podcast. You can also go ahead and just cross out Azalea is watching a Super Smash Bros. Melee tournament during the podcast. God damn, Cody Schwab is fire! But other than that, I am totally down for, Rocky III of Napoleon.
I have not seen Rocky 3, so we'll have to take your word for that. I've only ever seen the first one.
Never have I, but I've been told it's the one where he gets really cocky and is then humbled.
I see. Is that also the one with the Russian, or is that a different one?
I think the Russian is Rocky 4.
Okay.
I wouldn't know. I haven't seen any of the Rocky movies. I just know of them the same way I know about most of my media knowledge, which is the fact that, the media I consumed as a child was not media, but media made by millennial autists about media.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the human centipede of content.
I watched, the first Rocky movie on a bus during a school trip, so I don't exactly recall great much about it.
I've heard it's very different. It won, Best Picture, right? I've heard it's very different than the sequels.
Yeah. I mean, from what I remember, probably pretty good. But yeah. Anyways, so today we're not talking about the Rocky movie franchise. We're talking about the War of the Fourth Coalition. Now, we've done 3 of these already.
The coalitions are much like Rocky, where there's too many installments.
Yeah. Still got a few left. So if you haven't listened to those previous episodes, I do highly recommend that. Yeah.
Get the fuck out!
But, maybe if you know a little about those wars or whatever, and you want to skip to this, okay, whatever. But yeah, this war in specific will take place from October 1806 through July 1807, and was pretty much just a direct continuation of the War of the Third Coalition. Like, the war doesn't end between these two wars. It's pretty much just continues straight on.
It's like Attack on Titan. It's like, season 3, part 2.
Yeah, the Second Corps. So our sources for today's episode are The Napoleonic Wars 1805 to 1807 by Todd Fisher, Jena 1806, Napoleon Destroys Prussia by David G. Chandler, and Napoleon Defeats Russia, Friedland 1807 by Epic History TV.
God, I'm sure they're great because I trust you and you have like a degree and you're like an actual like history boy and shit. But like, that is the least credible sounding source I have heard in a while.
Epic History is really basically just Osprey's publishing like a YouTube channel. So it's pretty good. I mean, Osprey is like the publishing firm that just carries all of military history, YouTube, and podcasting on its back. If you are watching anything about like military,
before now.
Yeah, if you're watching like any military history related content online, very good chance that it's sourcing in large part this stuff published by Osprey, including this episode. So yeah, it's, they've been around for like ages. Some of their older books maybe not the best anymore, a bit dated or whatever, but for the most part, they're pretty good.
The American based?
I believe they're British, but I could be wrong about that.
Yeah, well, British historians have never done anything wrong. Okay, before we get into it, I have a call to action. I probably should have done this earlier, but every episode or so, we, remind you that there is not a single sponsor, not a single commercial on this show. So we ask you to give back. I am going to start to, create growth through brutal bureaucratization, neoliberalization, and quantification. All right? That's the modern way. All right? Everything's going to get worse, but I will get what I want done. And what I want is reviews and subscriptions. I'm going to give y'all metrics, okay? What I want, and I know hundreds of you motherfuckers listen to this. I want 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, and I want 50 reviews on iTunes. Preferably 5 stars, but if you're annoyed at me, go give me 1 star. It boosts me in the algorithm regardless. And I haven't even cleared this with Jay, but fuck it. I can just remove it if he doesn't want me to do it. As an incentive, if we reach the 50 reviews and 1,000 subscribers, by the way, we're currently around like 200-ish, 300-ish subscribers and like 6 reviews. So, far away, but very doable. I will do a podcast episode while getting blast drunk. And we'll pick a funny one to do it for.
All right, sounds good enough to me. I don't have any objections.
Jay, do you have an iPhone?
I do, yes.
Have you rated the podcast on your iPhone?
I have not, no. I mean, it's a big gauche to like rate your own stuff.
What am I going to do with this boy? What am I going to do with him?
I don't know. I'll have to find out.
All right, in August of 1805, Austria joined Britain, Russia, and Sweden in their war against France, launching the main stage of what would now become to be known and loved as the War of the Third Coalition. These allied nations came up with a grand scheme to attack France on multiple fronts, thereby dividing France's forces. Unfortunately for the Allies, poor logistics and coordination delayed their operations and gave the initiative to Napoleon. The French emperor quickly marched with the bulk of the Grande Armée into Germany, where he surrounded and forced the surrender of an Austrian army at Ulm before proceeding to capture Vienna and finally defeat a combined Austrian and Russian force at Austerlitz. By the end of December, Austria had come to terms with France, signed the Treaty of Pressburg, and withdrawn from the war. The War of the Third Coalition was a clear victory with France. The Allied armies had once again been humiliated on the field of battle. Only at sea had France been met with a major defeat, the famous Battle of Trafalgar, bringing any chance of a French invasion of Britain to a permanent end. More attentive listeners of our last episode may have noticed that Britain, Sweden, and Russia, however, are still at war with France, a state of affairs that would continue into the following year. Russia was France's main continental enemy, possessing by far the largest army out of any of the members of the coalition. For the time being, though, Russia would have to rest and regroup their forces before any further operations against France were possible. This lull in combat would see a new country come to the fore and take the fight to Napoleon. What's the new country, Jay?
That would be the everyone's favorite German state, the Kingdom of Prussia. Actually, not my favorite German state, but whatever.
What, you a fan of Schatzberg, Holstein, or some shit?
No, I like Baden. I'd say I prefer Baden to Prussia. But yeah, Prussia, we've talked a lot about them again in previous episodes, but it's been a while. So as a refresher, the Kingdom of Prussia was famous in the 18th century for their army. It was a common refrain was that Prussia was an army with a state. They were highly militarized. They had what was widely viewed as the best army of its era around the time of the 7 Years' War. And they had won almost every war they had been in.
What you think of as an army, like you, the listener, like you think of like soldiers and like wearing like uniforms and standing in ranks and files and marching together as one with shouted commands, like that is inherited from Prussia.
Yeah. Ever since 1795, Prussia had remained neutral in the wars between the European powers. This neutrality seemed to be in question by the end of 1805, where Prussia came very near to joining the war against France. Had Prussia taken action then, the disastrous Allied defeat at Austerlitz may have been avoided. The Prussian king, Frederick William III, would prove slow to act, however, and Prussia remained out of the war in spite of a clear violation of their neutrality taking place when the French army under the command of Marshal Bernadotte marched through Prussian territory on their way to outflank the Austrians in Bavaria. The Prussian court was divided into two factions when it came to the question of France. On one side, there was a so-called peace party led by the foreign minister, Christian Graf von Hogewitz. This faction called for a continuation of Prussia's neutrality, or even an alliance with France. The king himself was naturally predisposed towards peace. Unlike his famous grandfather, Frederick the Great, Frederick William III was not much of a general, and that was something he was well aware of. So even though he personally despised Napoleon, his natural inclination was towards avoiding conflict.
Now then you had the War Party, which had the advantage of not being led by a guy named Christian Graf von Hogewitz. Real ass fucking country out there. They were led by Frederick William's wife, Queen Louise, and included much of the Prussian army. Army wants to go to war. Big surprise. Louise was a strong Francophobe and had viewed Napoleon as an enemy of Europe. Prussia's top generals believed in the supremacy of the Prussian army. In their minds, they had never been defeated by the French throughout the Revolutionary period. Jay, can we get a quick fact check on that?
I would say that it is largely false, but true enough that you can make an argument. It's we've talked about the Battle of Valmy. That's when the Prussians get close to, marching on Paris, but they get halted by the French and they decide to withdraw with the idea that they'll come back next year. And obviously they don't.
Yes, famously the most important non-battle of history, right?
Yeah, so that's the thing where, like, if you're looking at, strategy, the French pretty clearly win at Valmy. They preserve the French Republic. But if you're looking solely at, like, battlefield tactics, the Prussians don't really lose.
All right, so collectively, the war party viewed Napoleon's creation of the Confederation of the Rhine and the crowning of his brothers, Louis and Joseph, as the kings of Holland and Naples, respectively, as a sign of Napoleon's limitless ambition to expand the French sphere of influence all across Europe. We didn't go super heavy into it, but remember, France is setting up basically puppet states all across Italy and the Low Countries and Germany and the like, and Napoleon's like, Bourbons are out, Bonapartes are in, we gonna have ourselves a dynasty, baby.
Yeah.
And honestly, God bless him. Nepotism is the natural way for humans to do things, and it will never be any different, and if you go against that, you're just not gonna have a good time.
No.
So, Jay, quick, when does the War of the Third Coalition end, like, on paper?
Yeah, the War of the Third Coalition ends with the Peace of Pressburg, which is in December 26, 1805.
Okay, so how like, big a lull period are we talking between these wars, really? Because, like, and did they even really think of them as separate wars, or is, like, labeling them as, like, different coalitions kind of more of a historical, scholarly post hoc thing?
It's more of a post hoc thing because, the war with Austria was over. That's when the Treaty of Pressburg is signed. But the war with Sweden and Britain, like we've talked about, and Russia continued. There was a brief ceasefire with Russia. But yeah, it's dividing these up cleanly into war of first, second, third, and so on and forth is definitely more of a post hoc thing. In terms of how long we're talking about the lull in fighting, we're talking, there's some small actions in the beginning of 1806, with the Swedes and Brits, like Naples and whatever. And then you have a few months of peace, and then we're really talking about hostilities picking up again around August, September. So you're talking maybe half a year.
6-7 months.
Yeah. It's not very long.
Long for Europe.
Fair.
So late 1805 and early 1806 see a flurry of diplomatic action across Europe's capitals. France secured a treaty with Austria and pushed for peace with Russia, only to be rebuked by the Russian emperor. I mean, they've beaten Russia in the field, but they're not really, like, threatening any of their territory at this point, right?
Yes.
Further west, Napoleon played a dual game, both seeking an alliance with Prussia against Britain and a general peace with Britain at around the same time. In theory, these two initiatives served to cover each other. Only one had to succeed. If Britain continued their war, an alliance with Prussia would strengthen France's position. And if France was able to make peace with Britain, then whatever Prussia did really didn't matter as much to Napoleon. Big brain play. It's going to work. It's great.
What could go wrong? The central to this diplomatic maneuvering was the status of Hanover. The Electorate of Hanover was a moderately large German state that had been in a personal union with Britain since 1714, which was when the Elector...
Now, wait. That's where them fucking Windsors are from, right?
Yeah, kind of. So 1714, the last Stuart queen, Queen Anne, dies, and King George I of England, George was the Elector of Hanover, he becomes the King of England, he becomes King George I. Because of that, Hanover is not a part of Britain, but the Elector of Hanover is also the King of England. In terms of the House of Windsor, the House of Hanover will die out in its male line. So the House of Windsor is what we call it was what was previously known as the House of Saxe, Coburg, and Gotha. And that's the family that marries around the time of Queen Victoria. Victoria is a member of Hanover, but because she's a lady, the dynasty technically doesn't pass, like the name doesn't pass through her.
So, also for those interested, I just looked it up. It's in central north-ish Germany now.
Yeah. Now, in 1803, Hanover was invaded and occupied by the French. Now, Napoleon was going to use Hanover as a prize in these negotiations. Napoleon knew that Prussia had long coveted the region and offered Hanover to Prussia in exchange for an alliance against Britain. At the same time, he offered to return Hanover to Britain in exchange for peace with France. When the Prussians learned of this duplicity, it was enough to push the war faction into the ascendancy. By summer of 1806, war was basically inevitable. Members of the Prussian elite guards famously signaled their intent by sharpening their swords on the steps of the French embassy in Berlin. On August 10th, Prussia began a general mobilization and prepared an ultimatum for Napoleon, calling on him to dissolve the Confederation of the Rhine and withdraw all French forces from the east of that river.
So, our boy is not going to get either of the things he wanted.
Yeah. Yeah, didn't really work out.
You love to see it.
Now, almost as soon as a general mobilization began, did the weaknesses in the Prussian military system begin to show themselves. Unlike France, Prussia lacked any sort of modern general staff system. The military that had been used to great effect by Frederick the Great during the wars of the late 18th century depended in large part on the personal leadership of Frederick the Great. The timidity and lack of experience of his grandson, King Frederick William III, meant that Prussia was now left with a group of bickering generals. While the majority of them had favored war with France, they all had their own ideas on how best to carry that out.
Meanwhile, on the French side, you have multiple marshals and generals that are at this point very experienced and could possibly handle whole campaigns on their own without Napoleon, and they can be slotted in and out of armies and shit.
Yeah, the weakness of the German general staff system is something that's particularly notable because Prussia will be famous for this in the 1870s when you had the Franco-Prussian War, and then they become Germany and going into World War I. And that's because they basically just copied
because
Napoleon's.
This is where they this is where they got their ass kicked.
Yeah.
And they were like, there's got to be a better way.
Yeah.
All victory comes through defeat, people.
The bulk of the French army since the campaigns of the previous year was stationed east of the Rhine and to the south of Prussia. They're down in Bavaria, so southern Germany. In between the French forces and Prussia lay the independent electorate of Saxony. Now, both sides knew that any battle between Prussia and France was likely to occur in Saxony. The Prussians would strike first in regards to this by moving their forces into Saxony and basically strong-arming it into an alliance with Prussia. Beyond this, however, they had little idea of how to proceed against the French.
Step 1, take Saxony. Step 2, ? Step 3, profit. I gotta love it. Alright, by September, there were no less than 4 plans being put forth by the Prussian generals. General
Scharnhorst.
That's not how that's pronounced, but I don't give a shit. Favored a Fabian strategy, slowing down the French advance at river crossings while waiting for the Russian army to arrive and link up with their forces. General Hohenlohe favored moving the main Prussian army to the town of Hof in eastern Germany, waiting for Napoleon to invade from the south, and then attacking the French flank. That sounds like it's inviting disaster. The Duke of Brunswick favored marching to the French... Wait, this guy's still around, or is that a different Duke of Brunswick?
It's the same guy. We'll get a bit more to him later.
Oh, you poor... He's got to be old at this.
Oh
This
yeah,
is like,
he's like 70,
oh,
71, I think.
oh no. The Duke of Brunswick favored marching on the French allied state of Baden and Württemberg, thereby forcing the French to battle. Finally, General Mazenbach, I actually like that name, advocated for essentially parading the Prussian army from Hof towards the Danube and back up into Saxony. What's the worst one? Just shoot from the hip.
Mossenbach.
Stupidest one.
Like Mossenbach, like doesn't really have any idea besides let's just like march south and then march north, and like the French will probably do something to respond. Like it's not really even a plan.
And all of these, except for like maybe Schnarrenhorst, our luminary and intellectual Titan Schnarrenhorst, are premised on the fact that if we run into the French army, we will win.
Yes.
Okay.
You know, Scharnhorst has probably the best of plan in hindsight. And maybe also with foresight.
Yes, which is wait for the Russians. We still, in all of these coalition wars, we still have yet to have the plan of get the coalition army together, go to France, kill them. The literal simplest possible plan has yet to be implemented. So finally, the king puts together a plan that combines elements of Hohenlohe and Brunswick strategies, but in practice, this is going to matter very little, as Prussian infighting had only served to give Napoleon the time to take the initiative, and we learned last time what Napoleon does with initiative.
Yeah. And by mid-September, French intelligence had picked up enough information on the Prussian mobilization to determine that war was inevitable. Napoleon was pretty surprised by Prussia's actions. The Russian army was still far to the east and would take quite a bit of time to march to their aid, meaning that Prussia would essentially be on their own. Napoleon thought this was, suicidal. And yeah, turns out he was right. Now, on September 15th, Napoleon drafted over 120 separate orders laying out the beginnings of the coming campaign. As the bulk of the French army was stationed to the east of the Rhine from, the previous years, Napoleon would take these forces and invade Saxony from the south. The French army would march through the Thuringian forest and then continue northwards to threaten the Saxon capital of Leipzig. This would be a difficult advance, but by doing so, Napoleon hoped to force the Prussians into battle and defeat their army before the Russians could come to their aid.
Yeah, and Napoleon has an army, like right there.
Yeah, not far.
Like a few dozen miles, really. Probably. Who cares?
Yeah. Indeed, the Prussians had totally miscalculated the speed with which the French would respond. On October 1st, the Prussians issued Napoleon their ultimatum. They gave the French emperor until the 8th to respond. On the morning of the 8th of October, 1806, the French army crossed the border into Saxony.
Oh, shit! So, Napoleon divided his invasion force into 3 columns, left, center, and right. It was thought the Prussians could possibly halt 1, or maybe 2 of the columns as they exited the Thuringian forest, but they would most likely not be able to halt all 3. The French forces that then made it through the forest would then be able to envelop the Prussians from behind. Napoleon did not know exactly where the Prussians were or what they were planning, which was fine because the Prussians didn't know exactly where they were or what they were planning. As it happened, the French left, led by Marshal Lannes, was the first to encounter serious resistance. Upon exiting the forest, his corps, roughly 12,000 men strong, ran into a Prussian advance guard of around 8,000 men under the command of Prince Louis Ferdinand near Schaffeld. What the fuck does the near mean?
That's not a part of his title. It's they meet up. They run into the Prussian advance guard under the command of Prince Louis Ferdinand near Schaffeld.
reset the clock, boys. Okay, I can do it. Upon exiting the forest, his corps, the left one, which was roughly 2,000 men strong, ran into a Prussian advance guard of around 8,000 men under the command of Prince Louis Ferdinand, end name, near the town of Saalfeld. I don't know, man. I just I saw stupid German words and I assumed they all went together. A cousin of the king, the young Louis Ferdinand was a dashing and popular figure, but his force was no match for the left column, and the prince himself would be killed in personal combat with a French cavalryman in the resulting battle. The Prussians had failed to halt any of the French columns, which continued northwards in search of the main Prussian army. Again, they're thinking that one, maybe two of their columns are going to get held up, but that was the most any one of them faced in terms of resistance, and they crushed pretty easily.
Now, the Prussian army in the area was under the overall command of the Duke of Brunswick, Charles William Ferdinand. 71 years old, the aristocratic Brunswick was emblematic of the Prussian army. He had served under Frederick the Great during the 7 Years' War and the War of Bavarian Succession, earning praise for his ability. 14 years prior to this current campaign, Brunswick had been in charge of the Prussian army that retreated from Valmy during the War of the First Coalition. Brunswick was competent and able, but he was a general of a different age. King Frederick William himself would join this force in the field, but the king left the decision-making to his generals.
Now, is the king also pretty old? Like, is Brunswick like his uncle or something?
No, the king's like middle-aged. He's not that old.
But they're all related.
Brunswick, I'm not sure exactly how he's related, but he's probably related. Yeah.
I mean, that's what the word duke means, right? Like, brother or something to the king?
No, duke just means somebody who's in charge of a duchy. They can be, like in the British system, yes, a duke is like a family member. But in other countries, a duke might just be its own separate nobility.
We're just slinging fun facts here, aren't we?
Maybe. Yeah. Upon hearing of the defeat at Saalfeld, Brunswick realized that Napoleon was maneuvering to place the French army between his forces and Berlin. Not wanting to risk being cut off from the capital, Brunswick decided to withdraw the Prussian army to the north, with General Hohenlohe in command of the rearguard. This decision would lead to the climactic twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt on October 14, 1806.
Thank you for conveniently pronouncing those names for me first. By the way, that sounded like a good decision he made. Probably wasn't fast enough. Alright, so at Jena, a few days prior to the 14th, reports from the French left reached Napoleon of a Prussian force amassing to the west of the Saale River. On the 13th, Marshal Lannes made contact with the Prussians near the town of Jena. Upon hearing of this, Napoleon determined that the main Prussian army was near Jena and immediately began to order nearly all of his army to converge for the coming battle. An exception was made for his corps of Marshals Devout and Bernadotte, who were ordered to proceed to the north before crossing the Saale and falling upon the Prussian left flank. Unbeknownst to Napoleon, the force that he thought was the main Prussian army under Brunswick was not actually at Jena, but around 12 miles to the north. The force that Lannes encountered at Jena was the Prussian rearguard under General Hohenlohe. Now, the land around Jena was characterized by hills and small towns, many of which would be fiercely contested during the battle. To the east lay the Saale River, which would play little role in the fighting. I mean, I guess this is better than Austerlitz. Sounds very similar, except hopefully less snow.
Don't worry, we'll get the snow later on in this episode.
Yeah. Now, the Battle of Jena began on the early morning of the 14th. General Hohenlohe, seeking to delay the French, took up positions to block Napoleon's forces. The Prussians started the day with around 35,000 men, while the French had around 25,000 men, which were mostly Lannes' forces. Remember, he got there first. The French would begin an attack on Prussian lines, battling for control over the villages around Jena. Hohenlohe's force initially held strong, with the Prussian general engaging in a static defense while awaiting reinforcements. These hills, probably easy to fortify and shoot from. But unfortunately for Hohenlohe, the initially outnumbered French army grew by the hour as more and more corps made their way to Jena. By 10 a.m., the French force had doubled in size to 50,000 men. By noon, they had over 90,000. Shortly after noon, Napoleon ordered a general advance. Severely outnumbered, Hohenlohe's men routed, with thousands of Prussians being cut down by French cavalry. It was around this time that Napoleon, confident he had just defeated the main Prussian army, received a messenger from the north stating that Marshal Davout had done just that thing.
You see, after they had detached themselves from Hohenlohe's rear guard, the Prussian army of Brunswick, some 52,000 men strong, had continued north along the Saale River. Unbeknownst to either side, they were on a direct course to collide with Marshal Davout's III Corps, which had crossed the Saale and was now marching south towards Jena. They're basically just marching on the same road, so they're pretty much going to run into each other. Davout's single corps had around 27,000 men, meaning that they were outnumbered nearly 2-1. Marshal Bernadotte had been ordered to support Davout with his own force, maybe the First Corps, but his men had become distanced from Davout's. Now, Bernadotte would later cite unclear orders for his failure to support Davout, but it's generally assumed that the lack of coordination between the two marshals was due to personal rivalry. Back in 1799, Davout had uncovered a plot allegedly involving Bernadotte to overthrow the French government, though little evidence implicating Bernadotte was ever found. In any case, Bernadotte would play no role in the coming battle. If it can be said that Brunswick was the personification of the Prussian military, the same is true of Davout for the French. Born in 1770, Davout was roughly half of Brunswick's age. Like Napoleon, he came from an impoverished noble family, and like Napoleon, he attended the military academy at Brienne as a child. Davout eagerly supported the revolution when it began, and quickly rose up the ranks during the early chaotic years of the Republic. In 1804, he was the youngest of the 18 men named as marshals of the empire by Napoleon. Brave, clever, and talented, history remembers Davout as arguably the best of Napoleon's marshals, a reputation that stems in large part from the events that we're about to describe.
On the morning of the 14th, Brunswick's army ran into Davout's corps along the road to the north of the town of Austedt. Determined to hold up the Prussians, Davout deployed his men in a defensive line, its center anchored in the village of Hossenhausen. The Prussians launched a series of frontal charges on Davout's line. The French took heavy casualties but remained steady. That's that French military discipline and army reconverging we had talked about. The Prussians failed to outflank the French, even though they had the numbers to do so, most likely due to poor scouting. It's also likely that the stiffness of Davout's resistance had tricked the Prussians into thinking they were facing a far larger army. A crucial moment would occur around 10 a.m. when the Prussians launched another attack on the French line. Brunswick, who was close to the fighting himself, was struck in the face by a musket ball, instantly losing both eyes. What the fuck?
Yeah, I think basically,
Poor
if you can
guy.
imagine a musket ball hitting the side of your face and going through one eye, and then
How is he not dead?
Well, he will die, but not instantly.
All right, okay, so he dies a few days or hours later or whatnot.
I think he actually lasts a month or so.
Oh, shit. Anyway, he's incapacitated for now. And now the king, who, remember, is not known for his fierceness or being a military brilliant boy, is in charge of the Prussian army, and he's gonna be slow to act because, as we learned from talking about James Madison, you really should not let your head of state be on the battlefield. Shortly after noon, Davout ordered his men forwards in a counterattack. Disorganized and demoralized, the Prussian army broke into a rout. Davout's men suffered greatly for their victory. Over 7,000 casualties. The Prussians had taken around 10,000 casualties, but over 3,000 men captured. When combined with the figures from Jena, the French had taken around 12,000 casualties, while the Prussian side had suffered 40,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Napoleon initially reacted to the news of Davout's victory with disbelief, famously telling Davout's aide-de-camp that his marshal must be seeing double. When it became clear what had transpired, however, Napoleon offered his sincere praise, eventually granting him the title of Duke of Arstedt. Pause.
Yeah.
Didn't they invade Saxony on the 8th?
Yes.
So they have just completely destroyed the Prussian army in less than a week.
Yes. They invade on the 8th, and Jena Arstedt is on the 14th.
When I was a kid, I remember learning about, World War I, and they were like, oh, everyone thought it would be really quick. And, I kind of get it now.
Yeah.
There was a time when you could do that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's... you get it when you read about this war and some of the subsequent wars. Yeah, the French began the pursuit of the Prussian army in an attempt to prevent them from reforming. This pursuit gave Bernadotte the ability to at least partially redeem himself for his inaction on the 14th. Napoleon will almost court-martial Bernadotte, but he eventually does pretty well in this pursuit. On the 24th of October, Napoleon visited the tomb of Frederick the Great in Potsdam, stating that, quote, "If Frederick were here now, we wouldn't be." His deference did not prevent him from confiscating the dead king's sword, sash, and standard, then sending them back to Paris to avenge the defeat the French suffered in the hands of Frederick the Great at Rossbach in 1757. The following day, the French entered Berlin, with Davout's 3 Corps at the front of their triumphal procession. Within a month of campaigning, the capital of Prussia had fallen to Napoleon. Prussian forces at Prenzlau, Magdeburg, and Lübeck soon followed suit in surrendering. In total, around 140,000 Prussian soldiers were taken prisoners by the French. The Prussian king, though, had escaped the near-total destruction of his army and wasn't planning on surrendering just yet. He managed to flee to Königsberg in East Prussia. Today, that city is known as Kaliningrad, and it's part of Russia, and this is where he's awaiting the arrival of the Russians.
Yeah, those Russians that exist, remember?
Yeah.
By the beginning of November, virtually all of Western Prussia had fallen to the French. The eastern part of the kingdom, much of which used to be part of the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was next on Napoleon's list. The French army marched towards Warsaw, capturing it unopposed by the end of December. The Prussian king had retreated with the remnants of his army to Kaliningrad, leaving the Russians as Napoleon's main remaining opponents in the field. A new Russian army under General August von Benningsen was amassing north of Warsaw, preparing to attack the French. So is the rest of us going to go down in Poland?
Yes. And also, if for people who have listened to our recent-ish episodes, might think that Benningsen is a familiar name, and that's because he's one of the guys who leads the assassination of Tsar Paul. So, yeah. He's now the guy in charge of the Russian army.
Hashtag calculated. The winter of late 1806 and early 1807 would see the French begin to encounter problems that would foreshadow future struggles in Eastern Europe. The French soldiers had won victory after victory, conquering 2 major capital cities in the course of 2 years, yet each victory seemed to only draw them further and further away from France. Napoleon's men were now faced with the prospect of campaigning in the mud and snow of Poland against seemingly intractable enemy. Morale dropped, and desertion, an old enemy of European armies, rose. The French army would not fall apart, but its edge was temporarily dulled. I'm sure many others were, but at this point, France has the most well-prepared and trained army kind of in the world, right?
Yes. Now, as French forces prepared to wait out the winter, General Bennigsen attempted to launch a surprise offensive. French scouts were able to discover Bennigsen's movements, however, which prevented him from catching Napoleon off guard. As Bennigsen then began to move to the north towards Königsberg, the French engaged his forces in a series of indecisive battles, culminating in the vicious Battle of Eylau on February 7, 1807. Eylau was a frozen bloodbath and one of the worst battles of the entire period. The two armies, each roughly 75,000 men strong, were set upon by a blizzard shortly after the start of the battle.
Yikes.
Yeah. The whole thing was a confused affair, with units on both sides getting lost and surrounded by enemy forces.
Double yikes.
Yeah, very much so. The French center containing Napoleon himself was briefly put at risk of being overrun by the Russians before being saved by a mass cavalry charge led by Marshal Murat. The end result was a stalemate, with both sides suffering around 22,000 casualties.
Triple yikes.
Yeah, this battle is so bad that both sides will kind of just cover up the losses and pretend that it didn't happen.
So was the blizzard so bad that they couldn't because they would have called this earlier if they had been able to, right? They were forced to stay there longer because of the weather and terrain.
Yeah, it's units lose sight of each other and they're trying to maneuver around, just getting lost. And for a while there's very little cohesion to even call it off.
Yeah, remember, this is a thing I've tried to stress over and over in this podcast, but in the real world, wars don't work like Civ 5, where armies just get slammed against one another until they're obliterated. You can run away once you've lost 10% of your guys. The human beings don't like death. They don't like suffering casualties. They probably wouldn't have fought for that long if they'd fully been aware of what was happening, but they weren't.
Yeah.
And that's interesting.
Now, basically, this meant that both sides needed time to recuperate from their losses, and that meant that the winter would be devoid of any other large actions. In the subsequent spring, the French captured Danzig from the Prussians and began preparations for a renewed assault on the Russian army. It would be General Bennigsen who would strike first, though, attempting once again to catch the French off guard with a surprise offense. Bennigsen encountered a portion of the French army at Gutstadt on June 5th, defeating them but alerting the French to his intentions. Basically, I think he wanted to reach the main bulk of the French army without being detected, and because he runs into this little force early on, that kind of there's no more surprise, and he decides to pull back. The French also outnumber the Russians in the theater. The French have roughly 150,000 men, while the Russians have around 115,000. And again, the element of surprise is gone, so Bennigsen begins a retreat. Napoleon assumed that Bennigsen would march back to Königsberg and as a result of that, he took the bulk of the French army in that direction. In actuality, though, Bennigsen had decided to march along the Alle River, taking his forces further east of Königsberg.
I want to interject with a much more important point, that Amsa is a fucking god, he is inevitable, and Melee is the most dynamic, unpredictable game that has ever existed in the history of sports. Holy fuck. Back to our regularly scheduled program. On June 13th, 1807, Bennigsen's men, while marching along the eastern bank of the Au, detected an isolated French corps on the opposite side of the river near the town of Friedland. Bennigsen decided to cross the river and attack, and to eliminate the small French force. The force Bennigsen had uncovered was a single French corps of around 16,000 men under Marshal Lannes. The Russians, on the other hand, had around 46,000 men. Now, Lannes' corps sent word to Napoleon and fought a successful delaying action on the 13th, holding off the Russians before nightfall. On the night of the 13th, Bennigsen brought the majority of his army across the river in preparation for the following day. Lannes, meanwhile, waited as the strength of the French corps system began to show itself. Word had reached Napoleon and the other marshals to converge on Friedland. By midnight, French reinforcements were already reaching the area, and by morning the French had doubled in size. On the morning of the 14th, both armies were arrayed in lines. The Russians with their back to the Owl in preparation for battle. Now, the Russians began with a large charge on the French left, but were repulsed by a French countercharge. On the right, Russian infantry was able to push back the French, who gave ground slowly instead of routing. The Russians still have numerical advantage at this point, right?
Yes.
Now, by noon, Napoleon himself has arrived as French corps continued to stream into the area. Even though the Russians outnumbered the French at the start of the day, by afternoon, the armies were of roughly equal size. I apologize for not reading ahead. Seeing that he was now facing off against Napoleon and the main French army, Bennigsen decided to retreat across the river. However, Napoleon launched the attack before the Russians could take action. Once again, decisiveness is Napoleon's strength. The Russians initially held up before routing as the entire French line advanced. The town of Friedland and many of its bridges were set ablaze by cannon fire, causing further panic amongst the Russian forces. Thousands of Russians drowned in the river, though most of the army was able to make it across safely. Again, most people can't swim these days in this period, and even if you can swim, freezing water, no. Big die fast.
Yeah.
By the end of the day, the French had suffered around 10,000 casualties and the Russians 20,000.
Friedland would prove to be the concluding battle of the War of the Fourth Coalition. Thoroughly defeated in the field, the Russian Emperor and Prussian King were convinced by their courts to make peace with France. Peace negotiations began between the three powers at Tilsit at the end of the month. Napoleon and Emperor Alexander I of Russia formed an unusual friendship, the both celebrating the event largely as equals. They're literally just hanging out on palace barges and throwing parties and parades and whatever. And
we're not going to be able to go through the whole thing coherently. It's going to be spread out a bunch of episodes, but you could write a very, I have argued this for years, a very compelling yaoi anime drama based on the relationship between Napoleon and Alexander III. Lots of ups and downs.
Yeah, this was definitely one of the biggest up. They really liked each other for a very short period of time. And perhaps as a result of this, and also because Russia itself hadn't been invaded, this means that Russia only makes minor concessions to France. Prussia, on the other hand, would suffer greatly. Prussia lost nearly half of its pre-war territory. Its westernmost possessions were split off and formed into the newly declared Kingdom of Westphalia, with Napoleon's younger brother Jerome as its king. Much of the east, meanwhile, was given to the newly created Duchy of Warsaw, a quasi-independent Polish state with the King of Saxony as its duke.
All right, how much work is quasi doing there in the quasi-independent?
A fair bit. It's a French puppet, but also considering that Prussia, Austria, and Russia had split up the remnants of Poland a decade prior, the Poles kind of knew that their choices were throwing their lot in with the French or not being an independent state at all. So, Napoleon to this day is generally viewed very favorably by the Polish people because, being a French puppet was their only chance at independence.
I mean, I guess it worked out for them a little better than all of the others.
Yeah. This meant that Prussia, previously viewed as one of the most powerful countries in all of Europe, had been defeated and dismantled with unprecedented speed. Like, this is worse than even the Austrians. Like, the Austrians still have the majority of their territory after several wars. The Prussians lose half of their kingdom in a couple of months.
Shit.
Yeah. And really, like, Europe after Tilsit is arguably the apex of French power. You know, you have the Duchy of Warsaw in the east, which, as mentioned, is basically a French puppet. Most of Germany at this point is within the French sphere of influence. They elevate the Electorate of Saxony to become the Kingdom of Saxony, and as aforementioned, they give the King of Saxony Warsaw as well, so he's a French ally. You have the Kingdom of Westphalia, which is led by Napoleon's brothers, one of his brothers. His other two brothers are the Kings of Holland and the King of Naples. He's created the Kingdom of Italy with a puppet king. You have the Swiss Confederation, which is a puppet state. You have a bunch of other like little puppet republics in Italy. You have the whole Confederation of the Rhine. So, yeah, a large portion of Europe is under direct or indirect French control.
Yeah, so like there's some British aligned holdings in the Low Countries. There's like Austria, the rump state of Prussia, parts of Italy, but like, and they've got Spain at this point. We haven't mentioned that, but they've got Spain too.
Yeah, Spain is a French ally. Denmark is a French ally. Sweden had a little bit of land in northern Germany called Pomerania. The French will conquer that actually at the end of this war.
So then they have the bulk of Western Europe.
Yeah. Yeah, they pretty much have all of Western Europe under the direct or indirect control. There is, however, one exception, and that would be Portugal. Now, the French controlling all this territory, you know, they decide that they have to get Britain out of the war. And if they can't defeat the British in battle, because, you know, the French Navy was demolished at Trafalgar, they will attack Britain where it hurts the most. They'll attack the British economy. And Napoleon does so by creating the so-called continental system. This is launched in the end of 1806. And the continental system is an economic blockade of Britain. Basically, he forces all these countries, which are in their sphere of influence, to cease any trade with the British and to block, you know, British ships from landing in Europe. Basically just hoping to, you know, destroy Britain's trade in Europe.
The classic, we got them surrounded from the inside strategy.
But Portugal, which had for centuries been an ally of Britain, kept on trading with the British. Now, this means that Napoleon, at the height of his power, with no real threats in Europe, decides that he has a new target, that being Portugal. And in order to deal with the Portuguese, he'll launch an invasion through one of his allies, the Kingdom of Spain. And that will launch a little affair known as the Peninsular War, which we will be covering pretty soon.
Tune in next time on Dragon Ball Z. Alright, but like this episode was short, so I actually have like a lot of analysis I want to do, and probably you have some too, and we won't coordinate because we're not smart. But anyway, so the Prussians, they're just complete 14 IQ.
Yeah.
They want to do a thing, but they don't want to plan for it.
Yeah.
And they just get shattered and run over. The Russians are a little more interesting to me. It's almost like they both are not patient and not decisive enough. Like, and I mean, you know, you can just like point at what's going to happen in like 8 years or so, but that's easy. But like, the Russians were like fighting even with the French for a while, right? And these like kind of slow retreating attacks, and France is getting weaker and weaker as it's farther and farther away from its area, from its supply lines. But then there's this moment where the Russians try and go on attack, but they don't press it fast enough, and so the French are able to like get their forces together and win.
Yeah, the Russians are kind of scared of facing the French on equal terms, with equal numbers.
I mean, not an illogical
Yeah.
thing, bro.
Yeah. And that because of that, like Bennigsen and Kutuzov in the previous war, and you'll see this in the future war, will do a lot of maneuvering where they try to catch the French off guard, but like the minute there's a sign of their plan going awry, they'll retreat. They'll pull back. And the Russians are good at this kind of maneuvering. But eventually the French are able to catch up to them and, force them into battle at Friedland, at least in this conflict. So I say that the Russians definitely do better than the Prussians. You can argue that's because the Russians have more experience fighting the French. They've done it more than the Prussians have in the previous years. But ultimately they are, still defeated in the field.
So, we'll cover, more of French internal politics and the continental system, in the Pyrenees War episode that are coming up.
Yeah.
But Peninsular War. That's a different P that's down there. I want to talk about Britain. And I want to throw something past you because Britain has been in all of these coalitions. Besides a brief peace between I think 2 and 3, right?
Yes.
They've been at war with France for 15 years now, like
Basically,
93
yeah.
to 92 or 92 to to 18. We're at 1807, so that's 15 years.
Yeah.
But there has not been, besides, Trafalgar, which is, categorically different, there has not been a lot of, British troops fighting French troops. And you've talked before about how the British Army sucks. I actually forget what I was listening to, but I was recently listening to a different history, either podcast or show or whatever. My life is a fucking mess. I'm writing a fucking novel right now. I work a job. I have a church that's doing fucking bullshit drama. My brain is in a blender. But my point is, it was recently brought to my attention, or I was reminded of, that at this period in time, the British have an obscenely massive army on land. It's just working for the East India Trading Company and is in India.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was wondering, this is kind of an oddball question, but are the British allocating their resources poorly? Did that create a drain of man? I know that the East India the trading company army was run by totally different people and often operated very scarily independently from the British Crown, but was that sort of a drain of good recruits for them, or did it did their other projects basically hinder their ability to launch land wars?
Yeah, India in specific is not yet pacified, and it won't be for another half a century, if even. So withdrawing forces from India and risking losing India is not something they would do, because if they want to preserve their nascent empire as well as defeat the French. There's also the fact that the East India Company army is kind of weird, quasi-independent. A lot of it's Indians who they're not going to bring over to fight in Europe, who didn't sign up to fight in Europe and probably wouldn't want to. You have some British people who also that's not what they signed up to do, potentially fight up in Europe.
Huh, I didn't know that.
That being said, you will see people come over from India. Most notably, a general known as Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, will come over from India. He was an East India general for a while. So they will draw men from India in the coming years. I would say when I joke that the army sucks, on the individual level, the British soldiers are pretty good. It's just that when you get to like a larger scale, like they don't have the ability to.
And you mean they're pretty good in terms of like they are well equipped and maybe well trained.
It's just that at the start of this period, their generals aren't really experienced with, coordinating and leading an army of 70,000 men on the field against a, equivalent foe in Europe. And that's because they haven't done that before.
Yeah, and they haven't had to do that. They've had to, set villages afire against guys in sandals.
And the campaigning in India is very fierce in a lot of ways, but it's a very different kind of campaigning. A lot of sieges, a lot of, insurgency type stuff. It's not like it's an utterly terrible army or anything. They don't have that ability that the French and even the Russians have. And I think a part of it is like they're not going to risk like making a big army and getting it all killed by Napoleon. Because even if you could say, well, maybe they put together this really big army and face off against Napoleon, well, there's a very good chance that they lose. and that's a big risk to take. So the British, at this point, and really for a lot of the war, will basically be the bank account of the coalition. They are funding the Austrians, the Prussians, the Russians with massive amounts of loans. They take on a role in these wars similar to the United States in the First and, to a lesser extent, Second World War, where they're just providing tons of money and eventually like weapons and supplies to their coalition partners and hoping that the coalition partners will do the bulk of the fighting.
Oh, so afterwards everyone's going to owe them, and also they'll have spent time owning massive swaths of the world. That's, yeah. Their heart's not in this to a certain degree.
It is, but it's just like, it's a different level of commitment.
Okay.
Where they're very committed to defeating the French. Like, they stick firmly in this war. Whereas other countries come and go. The British only leave for a very brief amount of time, as you mentioned.
I'm just imagining there must be a lot of racial slurs for Germans and Russians going around in Britain, whatever those are. Like, a lot of, like, those fucking morons can't hold their weight.
A lot towards, obviously, the French. I mean, British propaganda defines a lot of how we view Napoleon. Famously, the whole Napoleon as an angry short dude mostly stems from British propaganda. They definitely put a lot of like effort in other ways besides, directly doing boots on the ground in order to defeat the French. They will do a bit of boots on the ground in the Peninsular War, as we'll mention in the next episode.
But yeah, so, and France and Britain are in many ways inversions of each other right now. France has had to, as we talked about in the Haitian Revolution and the Egyptian campaign, had to give up on their shall we say, far-flung imperial ambitions. And they're concentrating on conquering Europe, while the British are spreading their virus across the globe.
Yeah, and actually a comparison that the French will make during the day is with Athens and Sparta, or Rome and Carthage, where you had this dichotomy of a major land power versus a major naval power. And the French like this thought because Sparta, the land power, defeats Athens, the naval power. And Rome, the land power, defeats Carthage, the naval power. So this is an idea that the French intellectuals definitely enjoy during this time period.
Yeah, but didn't both of them do that by like eventually becoming a naval power and
Yeah. yes, they did. They both built navies.
Gotta love the math.
Don't sweat the details.
No one does sweat the details. All right, I think that might be enough for episode 45 of the No One Is Competent podcast. Once again, if you want to hear me waterlogged on an episode, I want everyone, no matter where you are right now, run on over to the No One Is Competent YouTube channel, drop a subscribe, sign in on your parents' account, your sister's account, your high school's account. Get fucking in there. Apple Podcasts, leave us a review, 5 stars, greatly appreciate. 50 reviews and 100 subscribers, and I will destroy my liver on recording. You have my fucking word. I cannot go back on it. It has been written in blood. Jay, say goodbye to the people.
Goodbye.
Y'all be good, everybody.